HCI has borrowed a lot of concepts from anthropology, sociology, and other fields. And one of them, which is important in qualitative research, is the notion of thick description. And that concept comes to us from Clifford Geertz. I believe Clifford Geertz coined the term. Clifford Geertz was an anthropologist, and his landmark work was Interpretation of Cultures in 1973, in which he employed thick description. And he starts off by giving us an example of a situation that requires thick description. And the situation is 4 different kinds of winks. So they're identical gestures, they're all winks, but they have different meanings. So one of them is an involuntary twitch, which is not a signal at all. You know, your eye just twitches and you wink. Another is a conspiratorial wink. Another is a parody wink, so you might be parodying somebody who did a conspiratorial wink. And finally, a rehearsal wink. You might actually stand in front of the mirror and wink like you're going to wink when you see someone. So that's the same gesture, but it has 4 different meanings, some of which are more important than others. So an ethnographic description of these would have 3 characteristics. So the first characteristic is that it's interpretive. The second characteristic is that the subject is the flow of social discourse. And the third is that it rescues what is said and fixes what is said in perusable terms. And actually I lied, there are 4 things, not 3. It's also microscopic. So thick description has layers, that's a key point. And Geertz illustrates this with an example from his own work in Interpretation of Cultures of a situation that happened in Morocco in the year 1912. And the characters in this drama are, and this is a real thing, this is something that happened in Morocco in 1912. They're a Jewish merchant, a Berber chief, and a French legionnaire are the main characters. And the issues are the laws, customs, and conflicts. For example, the Foreign Legion hangs back. The Foreign Legion is new in Morocco in 1912, relatively new, and has military authority over the region, and hangs back and doesn't get involved in a dispute between the Jewish merchant and some Berbers. But then the Foreign Legion eventually asserts its authority. And a Berber sheikh assents to sheep stealing to legitimize traditional penalties. The Jewish merchant has suffered at the hands of some Berbers and demands that the sheikh offer the traditional penalties, which is that the Jewish merchant is allowed to steal some sheep. And it doesn't work out very well for the Jewish merchant. He winds up in jail because the French Foreign Legion eventually criminalizes his sheep stealing, even though it is a traditional penalty in the Berber culture. So it's microscopic. There are a lot of details. It's a very long story. I'm just giving you a few little tidbits of it. And a key point of the story is not that it is that it represents life in Morocco. It is life in Morocco. So the ethnographers don't study villages; they study in villages. And it's not a lab because there are no controls. So interpretation. What interpretation means is that findings are not hypotheses. Findings are not privileged. So this eventually has become a very important part of qualitative research, that findings are not privileged. So findings just support thinking with big picture concepts. And it's long-term. The findings come from long-term study. The findings come from mainly qualitative study. It's highly participative. And There's a fine-combed field study in confined contexts. So it has to be possible to converse with subjects, the subjects of study. So in fact, in the Morocco story that I just mentioned, Geertz actually interviewed the Jewish merchant many, many, many years later, who was involved in this story, and lived in the milieu of the Jewish merchant, so that he gained his confidence and gained his trust to tell him about this incident. Okay, theory is a problem in thick description. Theoretical development is in tension with conversation, fundamentally and irreducibly. And theoretical contributions are trapped in specific studies. So this is a big new development in 1973 in science. This was also became very fashionable because of Kuhn's work, which had just been published at that time, and people were sort of looking for paradigm shifts in science because of that. So theory apart from interpretation seems vacant or commonplace. Theory building is searching symbolic acts in social discourse. So he's trying, in the case of the Morocco thing, to find what the symbolic acts of the Berbers and the Jewish merchant and the French Foreign Legion are. What are the symbolic acts that occurred in the discourse between these three groups? Now, you could easily have a theory based around what you've already observed. You could simply say, I'm going into this situation with no theory, and I'm going to emerge with a theory that perfectly fits the events that I've seen described. But the theory in qualitative research explains, it doesn't predict. It explains what happened. So there must be some clinical inference, and you have to be able to identify the signifiers in the incidents that you uncover and place them in an intelligible frame. So a clinician, for example, in medicine doesn't predict measles. The clinician interprets matters at hand, interprets whether somebody has measles. So theory could still go wrong. And there's a model that's used by Geertz called the confusion of tongues model that was used in this event that Geertz described. And it's very popular among anthropologists. The confusion of tongues is that these, three groups didn't understand each other. So the conclusion is that there's no prescription for interviews or observation. Thick description is a way to think about what you're doing, and that's all. And that's the end of this part. So next we'll discuss ethnography in more general terms and content analysis. Thanks for your attention.